Welcome to the JOST tutorial, troubleshooting JOST outboard and universal inboard sliding fifth wheels. Periodic maintenance must be performed every 3 months or more frequently as required. Unlock, move, and relock the slider. Clean and remove debris from the mechanism as required. Lubricate the pivot points with penetrating oil such as PB Blaster or Croil. Apply grease to the grease zerk located under the bracket to grease the pivot arm bushing. The outboard mounting angles must be flush with the top flange of the frame rail. Use a straight edge to determine the slide bed is flat and the outboard mounting angles are within 30 thousandths of an inch from the top of the frame. Uneven wear or scrape marks on the inboard edge of the slide bed indicate the outboard mounting angles are installed too low, arching the slide bed over the frame. This slider is not fully locked. The release cylinder is extended, the pivot bar is rotated, the locking plungers are retracted, clear of the slide bed rack. The slider is fully locking. The cylinder is fully retracted. The pivot arm has rotated to face forward. The locks are rotated between the extended locking plungers. The locking plunger teeth must engage the rack. Use a straight edge to check that the mounting angles are flush with the top of the tractor frame. The fifth wheel and the slide assembly remain installed on the chassis. Check the slide assembly at the front and at the rear. The outboard mounting angle surface must be within 30 thousandths of an inch from the top flange of the frame rail. To correct mounting angle elevation problems, loosen all of the bolts securing the mounting angles to the tractor frame. Adjust the mounting angle using a straight edge to place the mounting angle flush with the top of the frame. The fifth wheel remains installed for this step. In most cases, the mounting angles will spring back up when the bolts are loosened. After properly aligning the mounting angle, tighten all mounting bolts to their proper torque. Actuated air cylinders will hiss. There is bypass built into the piston. Check the slide release air cylinder for proper operation. Check for adequate air pressure. The secondary air system needs 90 psi to operate the slide release cylinder. Check air delivery to the cylinder. Flip the dash switch to the locked position before disconnecting the airline. Disconnect the airline. Flip the dash switch to the slide position to energize the airline to blow water and debris from the line. If air is not getting to the cylinder, check the air supply system, valve, and solenoid for a chassis failure. If there is an adequate air supply to the cylinder, inspect the cylinder and linkage. Flip the dash switch to the locked position before disconnecting the airline. Connect the airline. Check the cylinder actuation independent of the slider release and lock mechanism. Unbolt and pivot the cylinder extension rod clevis from the slide release pivot arm. Flip the dash switch to the slide position to energize the cylinder. When operating correctly, the cylinder extension rod should extend 5 inches. Flip the dash switch to the locked position. The cylinder will remain extended until manually pushed in. Due to infrequent use, the mechanism may be corroded or bound with dirt and debris. This segment will show how to inspect and clean the release mechanism. JOST slider mechanisms use compression springs to engage the locking plungers. The system default secures the slider to the chassis. Use a hammer and punch to check for seized locking plungers by striking the center tooth. The plunger is loose if the compression spring re-engages the plunger. If the locking plunger does not re-engage the rack, clean and lubricate the plunger housing. Lubricate the linkage bar clevises. Use a hammer and punch to work the locking plunger back and forth until it freely re-engages the rack. Manually actuate the release mechanism by placing a pipe over the pivot arm. Actuate the pivot arm back and forth to break free dirt and corrosion. Clean all pivot points and spray with penetrating oil. Reconnect the release cylinder clevis to the pivot arm. Use the cab control extending the cylinder to confirm the locking plunger's release. Use the cab control, allowing the cylinder to retract and confirm the locking plungers fully engage. If the linkage remains bound, the pivot bushing may not have been greased over time and may need to be replaced. Disconnect the cylinder extension rod clevis from the pivot arm. Disconnect the slider double coil spring from the pivot arm. Remove the clevis pins securing the linkage bars to the pivot arm. Remove the lock nut and washer securing the pivot arm to the bracket. Remove the pivot arm from the bracket. Remove and inspect the bushing. Replace the bushing as needed. Reassemble the pivot arm, linkage, double coil spring, and cylinder. If the slide bed is out of square, the locking plungers will not line up with the rack. The mechanism will not lock properly. There are two methods to check if the outboard angle mounted slide bed is square. The first method uses a large carpenter square to visually check if the slide bed is square. The tool will be flush with a square slide bed. A gap will show if the slide bed is not square. The second method is by measuring the slide bed diagonally. If the numbers match, the slide bed is square. If the numbers do not match, the slide bed is not square. The slide bed can usually be adjusted to square by loosening the bolts securing the slide bed to the outboard mounting angles. Drive each side forward or aft as needed. Check the slide bed after each adjustment. Torque the bolts back down. Inspect that the locking plunger teeth are aligned with the rack on both sides. Aligned locking plunger teeth will engage the rack. Cycle the locking plungers to confirm alignment. Confirm the slide bracket is square. Release the slide bracket. Slide the bracket against the front slide stop. There should be no gap between the slide bracket and the front stop.